Lake County. There is no incumbent. Chris Kennedy is the Democratic candidate. Mike Nerheim is the Republican candidate. Audience questions are being collected at this time. If you would like to submit one, raise your hand, and one of the volunteers will bring you a card and a pencil, and then you can raise your hand again when you're ready. Questions must be for the issues, not directed towards one candidate. This forum will run 45 minutes. Both candidates will have opening statements of 2 minutes in duration, and then during the forum, they will have 1.5 minutes to answer the questions and 1.5 minutes for the closing statement. And I will be happy to repeat any questions for the candidates during this time. And we will start now with, we'll begin with the first opening statement, which will be given by Mr. Kennedy. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate the opportunity to be heard. I'm Chris Kennedy and I'm running for State's Attorney of Lake County. I'm running because I see a system that is broken, that needs fundamental changes at the very core. And I believe that I'm the only person who can do that. And I'll tell you why. For one thing, I have a track record of 18 years of experience, not only as a prosecutor, but as a private attorney whose private practice has been committed to doing the right thing. For people who are victimized, I've taken on people who were victimized by public officials in both parties. I have a track record of independence, integrity, and broad experience in all of the things that a state's attorney is likely to ever encounter, which includes not just the legal realm. Although the legal realm, I've handled multi-million-dollar trials, jury trials, appeals in Lake County, in Cook County, in federal courts, in other states as well. I've supervised other attorneys. I've won major cases, and I've taken on people of both parties whenever it was appropriate to do, because I don't ask who someone is or who they know. I ask whether they did something wrong and whether it can be proven in a court of law. Now, beyond the legal realm, I've also taken on things that were not my job to do. I've written the law for children and adults with developmental disabilities in the state of Illinois. I took on a cause that took 6 years of hundreds of hours per year, but I've written 16 different laws that are now on the books. That's a track record of independence, of leadership, that is ultimately what is needed. But I also have a personal reason for what motivates me to leave private practice and go into the job of a prosecutor again. And that is because ultimately the prosecutor's job is public safety. My family has been deeply touched by violent crime. My cousin was murdered, and my daughter is named after her, my daughter with developmental disabilities. That experience helps me to see the perspective and the need to get it right.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. My name is Mike Nerheim, and I am running for Lake County State's Attorney. This is an incredibly important office, as you know, which is why you're here. Mike Waller's been the state's attorney for 22 years. He's going to retire. There's going to be a new state's attorney, and it is about trust. It is about somebody that is going to represent all the people in this county. I've made it my practice, my entire legal career, to spend every moment in Lake County practicing law. Now, I have practiced civil law, but the bulk of my experience is criminal law on both sides. I've been a prosecutor. I've worked in that office. I've handled thousands of very serious cases on behalf of victims and on behalf of defendants. I've also been a criminal defense attorney. I go to court every day. In fact, I was in court this morning representing regular people against the state's attorney's office to make sure they're treated fairly. The reputation of that office has to be restored. Now, I've been a private attorney. I've been a prosecutor. I also teach. I teach evidence at Columbia College of Missouri. A lot of talk about DNA. I've prosecuted with DNA. I've defended with DNA. I teach DNA. I'm also on the Bar Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Bar Association. I'm a teen court judge. And I've also worked with the Stavens Center, which is a homeless center for women and children. So I've been active in the Lake County community. I was born and raised here. I want to restore the office, the reputation of that office. I want to tackle gangs, guns, and drugs. which are terrorizing our community right here in Lake County. And I also want to propose a program which I put out a couple weeks ago, which will help alleviate overcrowding in our jail, in our court system, giving those first-time nonviolent offenders a second chance, and allowing some of those cases to be removed from our court system so we can focus our time on prosecuting very serious cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. We'll now begin with the questions, beginning with Mr. Nerheim. You'll have a minute and a half to answer this question. We understand that currently there are no female investigators and only a handful of people of color working in the state's attorney's office. What will you do to increase diversity and make your workforce more reflective of the community?
That's a very good question. That's a very important issue. The state's attorney's office, there are 73 assistant state's attorneys, 143 people, 10 investigators, 16 victim counselors. And as you said in that question, there are no female investigators. There are 2 African-American assistant state's attorneys and 1 Latino. That does not reflect the Lake County population. Prosecutors serve the public. Prosecutors are the attorneys for the people of this county. And when I spoke earlier, I talked about trust. Everybody in this county has to trust the state's attorney's office and has to trust that those people working in that office reflect them and represent them. I will actively recruit in the minority communities and female investigators to make sure that the representation of that office is reflective of our Lake County community. We have a situation now where the state's attorney's office is no longer a stepping stone career. People want to work there, they want to work there their whole careers. Very qualified people. We can go out and recruit the best and the brightest from all sectors, men, women, and people of all different nationalities and colors, to come in and represent you, the people of this county. And I'll do that. I pledge to do that. I've spent a lot of time working with different members of the community, different community leaders, and this is something that has to be addressed because it gets to the fundamental issue, which is trust.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. The Chicago Sun-Times, almost a year ago now, wrote an editorial about the state's attorney's office in which they concluded, and I'm paraphrasing, that when you see people of like mind, people who all agree with each other, people who think the same way, view the world in the same way, that's how you can have a track record like this office has had, which has been national news and actually international news for getting it wrong in case after case after case, and in some cases they've been ridiculed for absurd conclusions, and even the appellate court called some of their conclusions absurd. How do you get that way? Well, from having the same people, the like-mindedness, the friends and family hiring practices, the hiring of people based not on what they know, but on who they know. So the first order of business for me, in addition to the conviction integrity unit, which I'm sure we'll get to later, is to have a professional hiring practice. We need real policies. We need practices that are based on making sure that we recruit the best, because there is a market out there. We can hire plenty of people who may not have been available when the market was a lot better. And actively recruiting people from differing viewpoints, differing communities is a core value. And I will actively, proactively recruit people who are not only from the African American community and the Latino community, but who also disagree and present different viewpoints. I think there's too much like-mindedness within the office, and that's a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. The next question will actually, the candidates will be allowed 2 minutes to answer. And Mr. Kennedy, you will be first on this. You'll have 2 minutes. Please explain how you will work to ensure wrongful convictions do not occur.
I've studied this for a very long time, and the reason I decided to run was because I saw the appalling condition of some of these cases. And when I announced, the first thing I announced was that the #1 order of business is to set up within the office a conviction integrity unit. This has been done in other places. This is something that has been studied very extensively. Ultimately, it is the prosecutor's responsibility to make decisions on even closed cases to ensure that you uphold the special ethical duty of a prosecutor, which is to do justice. And that covers closed cases as well as active ones. So what I propose is based on what other jurisdictions have done, is set up a unit within the office that is independent in the sense that it works outside of others, and it's to oversee the activities as well of others within the office. So first, there's going to be a retrospective review of any case in which somebody's claimed actual innocence, and that can be brought up by the defense or even by the prosecutor, because ultimately it's our job. I've talked to people at some of these wrongful convictions projects, and I've told them I intend to put them out of business in Lake County because this is our job, to make sure we have the right people. So I'm going to bring in someone. I'm going to publicly post this position. This will not be, as my opponent has proposed, a panel of experts that he has already named in secret without any authority to do so, but also that would do his job for him. And that's what I'm running to do, is to be able to make these decisions, because that's what we need. It's a change in leadership, not an artificial program to provide outside, allegedly. And another problem with that program is that when asked during the endorsement session of the Daily Herald recently, he was asked how are these volunteers going to be indemnified, and he said, well, they'll have to be sworn in. Well, there goes their independence, because once they're sworn in, they're under the state's attorney. So that's why every jurisdiction that has addressed this problem has addressed it through a conviction integrity unit that provides oversight, not only looking back, but going forward and making sure that the best practices are done in Lake County.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
Well, this is one of the single most important issues in this campaign. It's about restoring trust to that office. And we've had 4 cases that have been in the press with regard to wrongful convictions. That's 4 cases too many. We cannot allow one case, one wrongful conviction. I've dedicated my career to fighting wrongful convictions. I practice criminal law. I go to court every day representing regular people, making sure they're treated fairly against the state's attorney's office. I stand up to that office every day in the courthouse. 3 things. 1, we have to improve training from the top to the bottom. Every prosecutor in that office will be consistently trained and retrained as DNA and other forensic sciences change, because they change all the time. Secondly, we have to change the culture. The culture of that office has to be one in which every prosecutor goes to court every day with the motivation to seek justice, not just a conviction. We're not keeping track of how many cases each other wins. This is about seeking justice and doing what's right, not convicting people. And I have proposed an independent outside panel to come in and look at these cases. It's not a secret panel. It's a panel that will be divulged. I've promised the people that are part of this panel that I wouldn't release their names until after the election, because they don't want to be politicized. But this will be transparent. And I have the courage to know that I want people that are going to make tough decisions. They're going to make those recommendations and bring a fresh set of eyes to these cases, all these cases, and future cases. The decision will be mine. This is not an opportunity for me to try and put the decision on an outside panel. I want an effective, independent review of legal minds that have nothing to do with the state's attorney's office or Lake County. But I will be the one, as your state's attorney, to make those decisions and to take the responsibility for those decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. And we'll start with you on the next question related. Millions of dollars have been paid in claims to those wrongfully convicted. Do you think there should be a monetary cap on these types of claims?
No, I mean, if there's a claim that's a valid claim, I met a gentleman the other day at a lunch that my opponent and I were both at. This man spent 35 years in prison, and he was wrongfully convicted. 35 years of his life. I don't know how you put a dollar amount on that. So if somebody is wrongfully convicted, if they are due a dollar amount judgment, they should receive it.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy.
I don't think that you can arbitrarily cap a number on something like that. I think the cost in terms of someone's years in their life is very difficult to measure. But of course, I've handled cases not necessarily involving that type of damage, but involving other similar types of damages that go into the tens of millions of dollars. And there are experts that will testify in those cases, I'm sure, that we can deal with. And I've dealt with those cases, I've handled them, I've defended them before. And I want to point out that none of this should ever have happened. None of this should have occurred if the office was run in the right way. If there was disagreement within the office, it seems as if nobody felt the ability to express it, or if they did express it, it certainly wasn't listened to. So I think culturally, ultimately, that's what we need to change. And I've been outside that office for 14 years, longer than my opponent's been an attorney. And I don't have the personal and professional ties. I don't spend every single day in that office. And that's a good thing because, frankly, the practice of criminal law, while technically on opposite sides of the courtroom, involves in 97% of the cases, and we've looked them up, 97% of my opponent's cases are pled out, they're plea deals. So to say that you're going up against the office all the time may technically be correct, but ultimately you need to be independent of that entire culture.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, you'll do the next question, and we are back to a minute and a half for the questions now. How will you improve efficiency in the office? Can the timeline be shortened and cases still be properly researched? Are there different benchmarks other than time that demonstrate improved efficiency?
Efficiency is a major problem because, as the saying goes, justice delayed is justice denied. The office needs to be more proactive and also fight defense tactics to continue cases, because what happens very often, probably in most real difficult cases, is the defense seeks to delay the trial and the time in which a case will be brought, because memory fades, certain things may change, the outrage over the crime may diminish. That's why it's critically important to be proactive in pushing the timeline. Criminal cases move very fast if the prosecutor and the defense and the court decide to make them move faster. So a couple of things that I've proposed that will assist in the efficiency. First of all, as part of the Conviction Integrity Unit, which I forgot to mention, I also do have an outside advisory panel as to policies, not as to cases. You can't hand that off, but policies and procedures. There are best practices around the country. One of them is vertical prosecution, and that means for certain types of cases, the same prosecutor handles the case from beginning to end. So what I've proposed is a sex crimes division that is particular to those kinds of cases, because those are extremely difficult cases to handle, and if you get it wrong, the consequences are devastating, because those offenders tend to re-offend much more than others. Plus, you have victims who are uniquely victimized and traumatized in a way that many other victims are not. So that's why it's imperative that the office commit the resources to working up those cases from beginning to end. And that's why I'm going to have this special dedicated unit to foster that.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
I've spoken to some of the judges in Lake County about this issue, and there's a new program that they are planning, which is a different tracking system. So certain cases where there's going to be a negotiated plea early on in the case, those will be in a fast-track courtroom. Other cases will be in a standard courtroom, and there are cases just by their nature, murder cases, financial cases, white-collar cases that do take time, and those cases will take a traditional track, and I support that theory. Another thing that I've proposed, as I indicated earlier, is a program that I refer to as the Alternative Prosecution Program. And what this does is it allows for first-time nonviolent offenders, with the consent of the victim and the local agency, an opportunity to do public service, pay their debt to society, get treatment, go to school, get a job, stay out of trouble. And if you do those things, those cases will be dismissed. So we can divert some of those cases out of the courthouse, so the prosecutors in the courthouse are working more efficiently with their time. When I was a prosecutor and I'd go to court with a felony caseload, I would literally go into court with a shopping cart full of felony cases, all different types of cases. We need to allow our prosecutors more time to effectively deal with those cases and to represent those victims.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. We'll start with you for the next question. What is your vision for a child protection division?
Well, there is, the Children's Advocacy Center is in Gurnee, and the thought behind that is to allow, initially it was developed to allow an opportunity for child victims of those cases to have a more comfortable environment and where they would be interviewed by law enforcement. I spent a lot of time prosecuting child sex cases. They're very difficult cases to prosecute from an emotional standpoint for obvious reasons. But I do support that group, and there is a prosecutor in that group right now that is involved in the vertical prosecution model that my opponent spoke of. And I do support that model. And not just for sex cases, but all serious cases. Prosecutors that are going to try the case should be involved in that case from the beginning all the way up through and including the trial. But we have to make sure that our child victims are being represented. Those are very serious and important cases. And I would support the Child's Advocacy Center, help increase that. The attorney that I spoke about works on a grant. That grant's going to expire, and there's no funding for that grant. So we have to figure out a situation going into the office, how we're going to keep that one person, that very important person in that office, and add to that person. Because this is a job that one person can't handle himself. We have to add more prosecutors into the ad center and investigators so we can make sure that those cases are being handled properly.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. The dedication of a single attorney to the Children's Advocacy Center is a very positive step, and it's been done only recently, and that's what I want to expand upon with the dedicated sex crimes unit, because that attorney currently works on the workup, the investigation and the charging only. Then that case will go off to another prosecutor, and very often I've heard from victims that you get handed off, and that's where you can fall through the cracks, because if someone is not committed to your case from beginning to end, that's where the case can be dropped. So that's why it's critical to expand that unit and really commit the resources. So what I propose is transferring at least 2 attorneys into a dedicated sex crimes unit that will handle only those cases, which allows those prosecutors for a period of time, at least a couple of years, to develop the kinds of skills that are needed, because they don't teach you that in law school. But it also commits to you, a career path that would allow you to do that and develop your skills in your career as an attorney, while at the same time really making a difference for people who are victimized. And the victim's perspective is very dear to me, because I've been on that side. And you see how the system alienates people, and that's why you have to take extra steps and make the kind of commitment in a structural way, like I've proposed, to combat that natural tendency.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, what is your position regarding Lake County's responsibility to refer local residents accused of a crime to immigration and naturalization if they are not in this country legally?
Well, I think, first of all, it should be noted that, the state's attorney's office has a limited role in the enforcement of federal issues, and immigration and ICE are federal issues. And the other thing that ought to be noted is that your personal views should not overtake your obligation and your duty under the law. So, I think as a country, as a nation, we need to have comprehensive immigration reform so that it does make sense across jurisdictions, whether it's federal and state, exactly who is responsible for what. So when someone commits violent crimes, then obviously those people who are here without documentation, ought to be turned over to ICE. Now, what's happened in other jurisdictions is you've seen, for example, the sheriff deciding not to follow federal law. And I think the way to combat that is to really change the law for the better, and I'd certainly be an advocate for doing that. I have a track record of having done that as well. So, I think that's my perspective on that, and I think, I can really be a leader in terms of reforming it, because that is another case in which there's a lot of inefficiency. And then you also have people who don't have the ability to get a driver's license or drive an insured car, and that causes problems for everyone. I've represented a lot of people who have been the victim of negligence where the person had no insurance.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
Well, I agree with my opponent on this issue. We do need immigration reform on a national level, and there's talk about handling this state by state. I think our national government needs to take the lead on this. But what we can do as local law enforcement, as local leaders, is at the very least follow the law. And if somebody commits a violent felony in our community and they're not a legal resident, I think we need to notify the immigration authorities and let the immigration authorities do their job. And I'm not in agreement with certain programs that ignore that don't follow the law. And as state's attorney, you are the chief law enforcement officer for the county. And it's your responsibility to make sure all the laws are followed, whether you personally agree with them or not. I don't believe in legislation from the judiciary. I will make sure that the immigration laws with respect to state law are followed. And again, if somebody's in our country illegally and they're harming our community, they're going to be prosecuted, and immigration is going to be notified, and they're going to do their job.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Nerheim will answer first on the next question. Since you both have worked at the Lake County State's Attorney's Office as prosecutors, and violent crime has a devastating effect on the community, what is your record in handling cases against violent offenders?
Well, I've worked in every division of the state's attorney's office, from traffic to felony prosecution, and I spent time, a good amount of time in each division. And the way you typically advance in that office is you start in traffic, you go to misdemeanor, felony review, juvenile, drugs, and I've prosecuted in all those divisions. And I've prosecuted very serious crimes. And there's a difference between saying I've prosecuted a case or I've handled a case, because if you work in felony review, for instance, where cases come in every day and you're standing in court and you're handling a case at a time, you're simply passing that case along to the next day, and you could theoretically say you've handled thousands of cases. But I've actually had case loads where I'm responsible for hundreds of cases that are assigned specifically to me. Cases ranging from all different types of cases: murder cases, rape cases, violent felony cases, drug cases, and I've prosecuted all those cases to trial. I know what it's like to sit at night with a family member of a murder victim waiting for a jury verdict to return, because I've prosecuted murder cases. I've prosecuted rape cases. I've been in those courtrooms handling those cases from a prosecutor's perspective and also from a defense attorney's perspective. It's important to know that I go to court every day as a defense attorney, representing everybody in this county against the state's attorney's office, which is vital, because we have to make sure we're prosecuting the right people for the right reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. When I left the state's attorney's office, the last trial I had was an armed violence case in which the defendant was sentenced to 16 years, and I haven't looked him up, but I think he is still behind bars. You know, I did get an opportunity to handle a large caseload of felony cases, trials, and you know, I don't presume to represent to you that I've handled every single case in the world, because I've handled murder cases, but not done trials. And you know, I think we need to be careful about the phrasing which was brought up. I mean, prosecuted, yes, I have prosecuted the entire range of cases, but my opponent says murderers, and to my knowledge, he's only tried one murder case. And as a defense attorney, we looked up all of his felonies, and he's never tried. He has 0 jury trials and only 2 bench trials. So, you know, I don't want to get into too much puffery here, but, you know, I've handled every kind of case there is at one level or another. And part of being the state's attorney is, having done these cases, it helps quite a bit. But it's not the only job requirement to be able to step in and do a trial. But certainly one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to try cases. I'm going to try major trials, just like I've done in my private practice. Now, one other thing I would say, I have sat waiting for a jury verdict with family members of a murder victim, and that's been my family. So, you know, my commitment to fighting violent crime has led me not to defend cases like that, although I respect people who do.
Mr. Kennedy, how will you improve transparency and accountability in the office without compromising privacy?
Well, transparency is a huge problem in this office. Article after article written by national media and the local media as well have been met with complete silence, refusal to answer questions. You know, to me, you have to respond to the people who pay your bills. You're a public servant, you need to answer to the press and the public. And now, there are certainly things that cannot and should not be divulged, that are secret or private, but when you're making decisions that are costing taxpayers potentially tens of millions of dollars, you have a responsibility to step up and talk about it. So it's not just talking, though, because you have to live it. So, you know, the proposals that I have, the Conviction Integrity Unit, that's going to be a publicly posted position. Nobody's going to get that because they're my friend, or because I know them, or I've approached them during a political campaign. That's going to be posted publicly, and someone who is the best qualified person is going to get it. Same thing with hiring generally. And I'm really going to be very aggressive in terms of getting diverse viewpoints and diverse backgrounds. But we have to have a professional level of hiring. The Friends and Family program needs to end. And and this is another thing. My campaign and my personality, my background are all independent of the culture of the state's attorney's office. And when my opponent's campaign manager is a former assistant state's attorney who's son of a former assistant state's attorney and is married to a current assistant state's attorney, that says a lot about the culture and about whether they're going to continue that type of culture.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
I do have to address what issue with, I'm glad to know my opponent's so concerned with my trial record, but to be a little more accurate, I've tried way more than 3 jury trials. I've tried hundreds of cases, and I can give you the names and case numbers of each one of them. Now, with regard to transparency, that's an issue. It's an issue about trust. And the state's attorney's office, quite frankly, is not transparent right now. The state's attorney's job is to get out into the community and talk to people and listen to people. And that's something I've done throughout my campaign, all over this county. And I've learned a lot. I've learned from law enforcement, from chiefs of police, from community leaders, from pastors, and I've listened. And I'll continue that model as state's attorney. State's attorney's office hasn't been good with reporting with the media and responding to the media. Every single reporter that's contacted me throughout my campaign, I've given my personal cell phone number to. And I'm not changing my phone number if I win this election. I will be there to take those calls, to answer those tough questions, to represent you. And there are little things. The website. The website of the state's attorney's office can be improved drastically to help inform the community about crime, trends in crime, things that are going on, and also communication with victims. That has to be drastically improved. It has to start earlier and be maintained continuously throughout the process of a case, which can sometimes take months or even years. And all too often, victims are left out of that process, and that has to change.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Nerheim, how will you work with local law enforcement?
Well, I will say one of the things, I was asked, what do I think Mr. Waller did well as state's attorney, and I think that's one of the things he has done well, is his working with law enforcement, because I've met with every chief of police in Lake County. I've met with law enforcement throughout Lake County. I work with them. I've worked with them as a prosecutor. I've worked with them as a defense attorney, oftentimes cross-examining them. And I still have their respect, because they know that when I go to court, I'm there to seek justice. And I'll continue that model. And what you have to do with law enforcement is you have to listen and you have to work together. I spent 2 years in felony review, which is where police officers come in and they ask for permission to charge felony cases. And there were a lot of cases where I would not approve those charges because I didn't feel that the evidence was sufficient. But what I did is I communicated. I would tell those officers, I'm not approving your charge, and here's why. And they left my office, oftentimes not agreeing with me, but they always respected my decision because I communicated. And that's something that we have to continue and listen to law enforcement, because we have to work together. And as I said earlier, the prosecutor, the state's attorney, is the chief law enforcement officer for the county. After the primary, I set a series of meetings throughout the county where I invited chiefs of police to come and sit down, and I didn't talk, I listened. And this wasn't publicized, there was no cameras there, this wasn't part of a media campaign issue. This is because I wanted to listen to them and to hear their ideas on how we can run that office better and represent the people better. Because this issue of trust and the lack of trust in that office involves law enforcement as well, and they know it.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. As state's attorney, you have a responsibility to work with law enforcement to make sure that you get it right, that you protect the general public, and that you get it right on behalf of defendants as well. So as a prosecutor, your duty is also to uphold defendants' rights. But you also have, in addition to working with law enforcement, you have to be independent, and you have to provide an independent viewpoint, a devil's advocate viewpoint, as it were, and not be so close to the people involved that you can't say no to them. And I think that's been a major problem. I fundamentally disagree with the track record of the current office. In terms of working with police agencies, I think we've seen major problems here, in that they're too close. And so that when the police bring a case, such as some of the ones that we've read about in the media, that have obvious flaws, that the state's attorney's loyalties run more toward the protection of the officers who brought that, or their reputations, or the simple verdict that they may have obtained years ago. rather than to getting it right and making sure that you have the right person. Because fundamentally, when you get the wrong person, that means the right person's free. And in one case, we know that the right person went and murdered somebody. So that's where you really need to have oversight and independence. Now, you work together to get it right. And I spent time in that felony review division too. And I never turned down a case that was beyond a reasonable doubt. But I also never said yes to a case that we could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's something that we need to do as prosecutors, and every prosecutor in my office is going to have that ethic and that independence, so that we work together to make sure that people are safe. But you do that by making sure you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, would you change the structure of the office? And if so, where would funding for those changes come from?
The main structural change is to have the conviction integrity unit that I proposed, because by having a senior prosecutor within the office who also operates independently from the rest of the divisions and has an oversight function, you're sending a message to the entire office that this is someone who needs to be respected and with whom you need to cooperate, even if they're reviewing something that you worked on before or are working on right now. So I think that's the main cultural and structural change that will drive the kind of development toward what I've been advocating for since day one of my campaign, which is a model office. The state's attorney's office in Lake County ought to reflect the benefits that we have of living in one of the wealthiest communities in counties in America, but also one of the most diverse. We ought to have a state's attorney's office that is a model for others. So the first thing is the conviction integrity unit and its independent oversight of those within the office. Because if I'm elected, I'm going to have 73 attorneys under me who are appointed by my predecessors. So I need to have somebody who is independent yet serves me and will oversee that. So, and that will probably have to take the position of some other slot in terms of budget. But I've advocated for better spending and funding. I'm on the school board in Libertyville, where we have a AAA bond rating for the last 3 years. I know how to oversee and administer public funds. That's something I'm going to do responsibly, just like I've done before in public office. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
State's Attorney's Office budget is $13.9 million. 93% of that is staff, people. You can only cut so many rubber bands and paper clips. And as I indicated earlier, 3 of those positions are grant funded. Those grants will not be refunded. So whoever takes over this office, to talk about new positions, new people is not practical. We have to make sure whoever takes over this office is ready to find money for 3 positions that we're going to lose. Now, we're going to seek more grants, but grants are tough because they're temporary and they're not guaranteed. We can be more aggressive with drug asset forfeiture. Take money from criminals that are selling drugs and harming our community. My case review panel is free. The people that have agreed to serve on this panel independently are volunteering their time to work. That won't cost any money. We need to restructure the prosecutors that work in the office right now. And these things I see because I'm there every day. I was in a courtroom on the 4th floor, a DUI courtroom not too long ago. There were 5 prosecutors in one courtroom and 2 defendants. Down the hall there was 1 prosecutor and 100 defendants. We have the people, we need to use them more effectively and more reasonably. Another thing I would change with regard to the structure of the office is I would not start prosecutors in DUI court. Prosecutors right out of law school start handling DUI cases. Those are among the toughest to prove, and they're very important in our community. And I would also have more experienced prosecutors working in felony review, which is the gateway to the entire criminal justice system.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. And question for you. Should the state's attorney office be nonpartisan? What would you do to make this office more nonpartisan?
Absolutely. I've said from day one, when you start talking politics, Democrat, Republican, with regard to the state's attorney's office, you lose the point. This is not a political office. I'm running as a Republican. I'm proud to be a Republican. I recently turned money down from the Republican Party. I haven't taken any PAC money. This is something that I believe, and I don't just talk about it. This is not a political office, and anybody that followed my primary knows that I was not the Republican Party's choice. The Republican Party picked somebody to replace Mike Waller, and it wasn't me. And I went out and every single elected official endorsed my opponent. Every Republican precinct committeeman in this county was working for my opponent. And I went out with my friends and my family, and I won. And what's important about that is, as I stand here right now, I'm not beholden to either party. I want to represent you. If somebody breaks the law, I don't care if they're a Republican or a Democrat. There's a perception right now that the good old boys run the state's attorney's office. And that may be true. But I beat the good old boys, because the good old boys were not supporting me in my primary. And I haven't accepted their support now. I'm going to keep working for you.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. Mr. Kennedy.
When I announced in July of last year that I was running against Mike Waller. And the first thing I said was, in addition to what I was proposing in terms of practical solutions, was to remove politics from the state's attorney's office. Politics has had too much of an influence over decision-making at many, many levels, from high-profile cases to even the small ones. There's a lot of who you know that has gone on there for a very long time, and it's part of this culture. 32 years of one-party control and dominance, the hiring practices that have gone on, and I am a Democrat, but like I said, I've taken on in my private practice public officials in both parties, and that ruffled some feathers, and that was uncomfortable, but that was the right thing to do, and that's what I'm all about. So I've said this before: if my mother comes to Lake County and commits a crime, she's going to be prosecuted. But she's not going to be prosecuted by me, because what you do in that instance is you bring on a special prosecutor, an independent prosecutor, and that's something that has not been done to the fullest extent. So in terms of party backing, my opponent had plenty of elected officials, judges backing him in the primary, and to say that he has not taken money from the Republican Party is perhaps technically true, but those who fund the Republican Party have funded his campaign, including a recent $10,000 donation by the main funder of the Republican Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. This will be the last question before the closing statements. Mr. Kennedy, in terms of both criminal and civil, what particular legal areas need more focus at this time by the office, and why?
Well, for one, I believe that the sex crime cases need special attention. I think that, and having been in a felony courtroom with a huge caseload, where you have a sex case that may not have been worked up very well, and that may have proof difficulties, it's a lot harder to toe a hard line on those cases than a simple drug case, or a case that only requires a professional to be your witness. So that's why you need to focus more on developing those cases and working them up from the beginning, and making sure that you have the commitment to getting those cases right, because they're the most difficult. In terms of civil cases, I think there's a lot in the office that is outsourced currently that ought to be taken in-house, and there's only 10 attorneys in that division, but I do think that the cost that is involved in outsourcing some of them can certainly be realized for taxpayers. I also think that we can develop people's careers in a way that lead to expertise in certain areas. So that's why committing to a couple of years in the sex crimes unit makes it better for everybody. Same thing with the drug division, which I think in a lot of ways has outlived its initial purpose. That ought to be repurposed toward focusing on gangs. There's a new statute out there that Anita Alvarez, who endorsed me recently, the Cook County State's Attorney, got passed, that allows for some of the tools that federal prosecutors use.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
Well, there is, and sometimes the civil division is sort of forgotten in these discussions, and there is a civil division in the state's attorney's office. There's 10 attorneys in that division. They do very important work. They represent the county employees, the county board, and again, it's a very important division. We don't hear a lot about the civil division, and I think largely it's because they're doing their job. They're working. Now, there are things we can do to restructure, and I do agree we should not outsource a lot of the cases that are outsourced. We have 10 attorneys that we're paying right now, qualified, dedicated attorneys that can handle those cases that we still give money to private attorneys to handle. So we can do a lot to work more effectively in the civil division and handle those cases in-house, saving taxpayer money, or perhaps hiring more prosecutors. Because to answer your question, criminal is more important. And I'll just say it in one word. Civil cases are important, but when you go to court on a criminal case, whether it's a traffic case, a misdemeanor case, a felony case, you're talking about something that's more important than any amount of money, than any judgment. You're talking about justice, you're talking about liberty, and that's important to people. This is about people, victims and defendants. The problems that we're seeing right now in that office have to do with criminal cases. And again, I've dedicated my life, my career, to criminal law on both sides. I know how to fix this problem, and I will.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. For our closing statements, we will begin with Mr. Kennedy. You have a minute and a half.
Thank you. I've dedicated my career to independence and integrity. I've turned down cases that could have made me money because I didn't want to be on that side of a case. And that's what's motivated me throughout my life. I started, in college, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted to be a prosecutor. That's why I went to law school. I did internships with the U.S. Attorney's Office, Director of Public Prosecutions in Ireland. And ultimately, when I was an assistant state's attorney here, it was the most fulfilling work I could imagine doing. And to me, that is what is most important. I have a track record for a long time of being independent and of doing the right thing, even when that is the hard thing to do, and it usually is. And when I see what's gone on here in Lake County, the injustice, the cost to taxpayers, and then ultimately the cost of public safety that's involved when you get it wrong, that is fundamentally wrong. And so I feel a need to do something about that. I'm the only candidate in this race who has a demonstrated track record of leadership and independence and the diverse background that is required to manage an office of 73 attorneys and another 70 plus employees. I've managed and supervised attorneys and other personnel, and as I said, I've written the law. I've actually led years-long statewide movements, and I do have a personal reason for wanting to ensure that justice is done in all cases. A vote for me is a vote to change the practices and the course of what's gone on here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nerheim.
Well, as I said earlier, it's about trust. State's attorney has the power to do two very important things. Make sure our streets are safe, and make sure that those people that have contact with our criminal justice system are treated fairly. And again, I've been on both sides. Wrongful convictions are something that I care very much about. I don't just talk about wrongful convictions. I go to court every day and represent regular people, again, against the state's attorney's office, standing up to them in court. I practice what I preach. I am independent, and you can look at my background. Look at both of our backgrounds. I haven't represented either party. When I went to the party for support early in the primary, they told me they couldn't support me because I haven't done any work for the party. I haven't been there for the party, and you know what? They were right. I haven't been. I haven't worked for either party. I've been raising a family and practicing law. And I'm not beholden to either party. I'm not beholden to any groups, any special interest groups. I want to be beholden to you, because the prosecutor is the people's attorney. As a defense attorney, when I go to court, I'm there to represent my client. And all I care about when I go to court now is my client. But as a prosecutor, when you go to court, it's a very different job, and a much more important job, because you're there to represent the victim, but you're also there to make sure the defendant's treated fairly. And again, I have the experience to restore pride to the state's attorney's office.
Thank you, Mr. Nerheim. This concludes the forum. I'd like to thank the audience for your participation today, and thank you to the sponsoring organizations, the Daily Herald, the Lake County Bar Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the League of Women Voters of Lake County. Don't forget to vote either during early voting between October 22nd and November 3rd, or on Election Day, Tuesday, November 6th. Thank you.